This is Land of Havilah, Isaiah 37. In the last chapter, Rabshakeh stood at the base of the wall and issued an ultimatum. Option A, you can surrender and go back to your lands and farms immediately. You can live there peacefully until we relocate you. Option 2, if you don't surrender, we'll lay siege and starve you out. You'll be eating your own dung and drinking your own urine. And by the way, don't count on Yahweh, because no God of any land has ever been able to defend his land against us. The overwhelming temptation will be to surrender because the war is all but lost. Libnah is under siege, all Judah is considered a lost cause, and Jerusalem is next. After all, Rabshakeh was accompanied by part of the Assyrian army, and they walked right up to the wall of Jerusalem without resistance. But Isaiah has been prophesying Yahweh will protect Jerusalem. At the end of the last chapter, the envoys who listened to Rabshakeh delivered his message to King Hezekiah. Now, verse 1. When King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into Yahweh's house. He sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and the elders of the priest, covered with sackcloth, to Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz. They said to him, Thus says Hezekiah, Today is a day of trouble and of rebuke and of rejection, for the children have come to the birth, and there is no strength to give birth. It may be Yahweh your God will hear the words of Rabshakeh, whom the king of Assyria his master has sent to defy the living God, and will rebuke the words which Yahweh your God has heard. Therefore lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left. Comment in verses 1 to 4. When Hezekiah heard Rabshakeh's demands, he covered himself with sackcloth and went to the temple. No doubt he prayed there. And he sent a message to Isaiah that this is a day of trouble and rebuke and rejection. He knew it was Yahweh doing the troubling, rebuking, and rejection. He knows Yahweh promised through Moses that this sort of thing wouldn't happen if Israel was faithful. Leviticus 26:6. Personally, Hezekiah has been faithful, 2 Kings 18:5, but not the nation, Isaiah 1:4. In verse 3, we can have cesarean birth these days, so we're not familiar with a woman who goes into labor and can't deliver. Labor could go on for days until the woman completely gave up and she knew she would die. It became a death watch. That's the situation in Jerusalem. There's zero strength to deliver. In verse 4, Hezekiah has only one idea, only one ray of hope. Maybe Rabshakeh has insulted Yahweh to the point that Yahweh will rebuke his words, meaning maybe Yahweh will teach him a lesson. Coming up, Hezekiah's men went to Isaiah, gave him the report, and Isaiah has a word for Hezekiah. Verse 5. So the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah. Isaiah said to them, Tell your master, Yahweh says, Don't be afraid of the words that you've heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I'll put a spirit in him, and he'll hear news, and will return to his own land. I'll cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. Comment, Hezekiah wanted Isaiah to pray, but in verses 6 and 7 he got a prophecy out of the deal. Yahweh says through Isaiah to Hezekiah, Don't be afraid. I heard Rabshakeh when he blasphemed me, so here's what I'm going to do. The king of Assyria will hear a certain piece of news. I'll put a spirit in him, meaning I'll take control of his spirit, and he'll return to his own land. He'll die there by the sword. Coming up after delivering the ultimatum to Jerusalem, Rabshakeh returned to his king. Verse 8. So Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria warring against Libnah, for he had heard that he was departed from Lachish. He heard news concerning Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia. He has come out to fight against you. When he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah, saying, Thus you shall speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah, saying, Don't let your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying, Jerusalem won't be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, you've heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the lands by destroying them utterly. Shall you be delivered? Have the gods of the nations delivered them, which my fathers have destroyed? Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the children of Eden who were in Telassar? Where's the king of Hamath, and the king of Arpad, and the king of the city of Sepharvaim, of Hena and Ivah? Comment in verse 8, Libnah is about 15 miles from Jerusalem. Rabshakeh went there to report to his king, King Sennacherib. The king had been in Lachish of Judah, but we assume Lachish has fallen because all the cities are falling, and now the battle is at Libnah. In verse 9, Sennacherib has received a report that the Ethiopian king is marching towards him. This means Sennacherib will be more urgent about Jerusalem surrendering. In verses 9 to 13, Sennacherib sent more messengers to Jerusalem with a letter this time. It was another demand for surrender. The logic was the same. Haven't we been victorious everywhere we go? We've utterly destroyed every nation that resisted us. Don't let Yahweh deceive you. He can't protect you. No God has ever stopped us. And Sennacherib named 9 kingdoms that made the mistake of depending on their gods. Verse 14. Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. Then Hezekiah went up to Yahweh's house and spread it before Yahweh. Hezekiah prayed to Yahweh, saying, Yahweh of armies, the God of Israel, who's enthroned among the cherubim, you are the God, even you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Turn your ear, Yahweh, and hear. Open your eyes, Yahweh, and behold. Hear all the words of Sennacherib, who has sent to defy the living God. Truly, Yahweh, the kings of Assyria have destroyed all the countries and their land, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they've destroyed them. Now therefore, Yahweh our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are Yahweh, even you only. Comment in verses 14 to 21, Hezekiah took Sennacherib's letter to the temple, spread it out before Yahweh, and prayed, Yahweh, you aren't like the gods of the other nations. You made heaven and earth. The other nations don't recognize you, but you alone are God of them all. Sennacherib has defied you. It's true what he says, that he and his predecessors destroyed every nation and cast their gods in the fire, which isn't surprising because they weren't gods. They were manufactured from wood and stone. Now therefore save us, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you and you only are Yahweh. Coming up, Isaiah has another prophecy for Hezekiah, verse 21. Then Isaiah the son of Amoz sent to Hezekiah, saying, Yahweh the God of Israel says, because you prayed to me against Sennacherib, king of Assyria, this is the word which Yahweh has spoken concerning him. The virgin daughter of Zion has despised you and ridiculed you. The daughter of Jerusalem has shaken her head at you. Whom have you defied and blasphemed? Against whom have you exalted your voice and lifted up your eyes on high? Against the Holy One of Israel. By your servants have you defied the Lord, and have said, with the multitude of my chariots I've come up to the height of the mountains, to the innermost parts of Lebanon. I'll cut down its tall cedars and its choice cypress trees. I'll enter into its farthest height, the forest of its fruitful field. I've dug and drunk water with the sole of my feet. I'll dry up all the rivers of Egypt. Have you not heard how I've done it long ago and formed it in ancient times? Now I've brought it to pass that it should be yours to destroy fortified cities, turning them into ruinous heaps. Therefore the inhabitants had little power. They were dismayed and confounded. They were like the grass of the field, and like the green herb, like the grass on the housetops, and like a field before its crop has grown. But I know you're sitting down, you're going out, you're coming in, and you're raging against me. Because of your raging against me, and because your arrogance has come up into my ears, therefore I'll put my hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips, and I'll turn you back by the way by which you came. Comment in verse 22, Yahweh says, the virgin daughter of Zion and Jerusalem has despised Sennacherib and shaken her head at him. We get the picture of a man making overtures to a woman, and the woman gives him the not-so-subtle brush-off. She despises him and shakes her head. The man has no choice but to walk away embarrassed. Sennacherib will walk away in shame, is the message. In verse 23, you, Sennacherib, have defied the Holy One of Israel. In verse 24, Yahweh says, Sennacherib came to Lebanon with all the glory of its impressive mountains and massive forests. Two things he didn't have in Mesopotamia, mountains and forests. And Sennacherib was victorious there, according to his great confidence in himself. In verse 25, likewise, when Sennacherib arrives in Egypt, he assumes he'll conquer again because of his godlike abilities. In verse 26, Yahweh says, this is what you think, but here are the facts. It's not your ability, it's been me all along. I ordained it long before you were born, and now I've brought it to pass that you would destroy cities according to my power. In verse 27, that's why the inhabitants of those cities had no power. I, Yahweh, was the power behind all your victories. In verse 28, I, Yahweh, know when you sit down, when you go out, when you come in. I know when you scratch your nose, and I know how you rage against me. I didn't miss a word of your insults. In verse 29, because of your arrogance, I'll put a hook in your nose, a bridle in your mouth, and turn your head like an animal the way I want you to go. You'll go back on the same road that brought you here. That was all to Sennacherib, for Hezekiah to hear. Now Yahweh says straight to Hezekiah, verse 30, This shall be a sign to you. You'll eat this year that which grows of itself, and in the second year that which springs from the same, and in the third year sow and reap and plant vineyards and eat their fruit. Comment, Yahweh says there'll be no planting in Judah this year because of the war, and there'll be no planting next year. Maybe that was because the Assyrians would still be at large, but in the season after that, Yahweh says you'll have control of your land again, and you'll be able to plant. You'll even have enough confidence to plant vineyards, knowing it takes years for a vineyard to grow, and knowing you need stability to even think about it. Verse 31. The remnant that has escaped of the house of Judah will again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem a remnant will go out, and survivors will escape from Mount Zion. The zeal of Yahweh of armies will perform this. Comment in verses 31 and 32, the remnant of Judah who escape means everyone who escapes this war alive, and everyone who escapes Yahweh's wrath alive. They'll take root downward and bear fruit upward. The survivors in Judah will have a future. Verse 33. Therefore Yahweh says concerning the king of Assyria, he'll not come to this city, nor shoot an arrow there, neither will he come before it with shield, nor cast up a mound against it. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return, and he shall not come to this city, says Yahweh. For I'll defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. Comment in verse 35, Yahweh will defend Jerusalem for his own sake and for David's sake. David lived 300 years previously, but he still factors in. Since Yahweh is doing this for David's sake, it must mean David is still alive. Of course, there was no chance Sennacherib would listen to this prophecy. He already said he has no regard for Yahweh. Therefore, Yahweh spoke to him in the following manner. Verse 36. Then Yahweh's angel went out and struck 185,000 men in the camp of the Assyrians. When men arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed, went away, returned to Nineveh, and stayed there. Comment, message received. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers died overnight in camp. It could only be Yahweh. Sennacherib had no choice but to withdraw and run for his life. In verse 37, he went home to Nineveh, which was about 700 miles. While he was there, verse 38, as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch his god, Adramelech and Sharezer his sons struck him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat. Esarhaddon his son reigned in his place. Comment, 2 of his sons killed him, and another of his sons reigned in his place. In 1830, archaeologists discovered a clay tablet with cuneiform writing in the ruins of Nineveh. The tablet's now housed in the Oriental Institute in Chicago. It's called Sennacherib's Prism, or the Taylor Prism, or the Annals of Sennacherib. It details Sennacherib's campaign against Judah during the reign of King Hezekiah, and speaks of trapping Hezekiah in the city, quote, like a caged bird, end quote. However, there's no mention of defeating him. The attack on Judah is dated to 701 BC based on a combination of that tablet, other Assyrian records, and archaeology in Israel. Siege works at Lachish and other Judahite cities have been discovered and support the same time frame. Also, an Assyrian relief discovered at Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh depicts the siege of Lachish. It's housed in the British Museum. The takeaway is that Yahweh is God and the gods of the other nations are not. Isaiah 38 is next.